Hey, I'm Mike with woodshopmike.com, and today I'm going to show you how to build this outdoor side table. Now this is one of those projects where jigs and templates are really going to come in handy, so that's what we're going to start with. At the bandsaw, I cut as close as possible to the line. Now over at the oscillating sander, I true up that surface, and then I mark a center line for reference a little bit later on. The top for this table is going to be circular, so I'm making the first template for that circular top. Here I'm just using a circle cutting router jig, and I'm taking about 3 passes to make it all the way through this 1/2 inch MDF. This is the first place where those templates come in handy. So here I'm marking out where I'm going to make cuts for the braces and the apron. Now that I've figured out how much stock I need to make all of those pieces, I just give it a rough cut over at the miter saw, and then I start breaking down the rest of my material. So over at the joiner, we're going to start the rough milling process. Obviously right here, I'm just getting the first surface flat, and then we'll run things through the planer in a little bit. So over at the planer, I'm going to bring these boards down to their rough thickness. With the rough milling all wrapped up, it's time for our first glue up of this project. Now here I'm gluing up the outer ring that will make the tabletop. I found that putting 2 parallel clamps on each side just made it a little bit easier to manage this glue up. So once the glue's all cured and the top ring is out of clamps, we head over to the bandsaw and cut it to its rough size. Now here I'm probably staying about 1/8 away from the line, just so that way it's a little bit easier to line up my template later on. I don't have a scroll saw in my shop, so the jigsaw was the obvious answer for me. It took a little bit longer, but with a little bit of ingenuity, I got the bulk of the material removed without too much trouble. Now I want to tell you real quick about the router bit that I'm using for this step, and actually all the template routing that I do here in a little bit. This is a double bearing bit, so it has a bearing at the top and at the bottom of the router bit. Now what that allows me to do is raise and lower the bit, so that way I can compensate for grain direction in the material without actually having to change the bit each time I need to change directions. Now, if you haven't done a lot of template routing on a router table, it can be a little bit intimidating, but the thing that makes this the easiest is to just ease into the cut and then apply slow, steady pressure, and you won't have any issues. So moving on, it's time to lay out and cut the slats for our tabletop. I've attached these to a circle template that fits very nicely inside of our tabletop. And as you see, I'm just rough cutting them, and now I'm cleaning them up on the router table again. So the way I'm going to attach all of these slats to the tabletop is with pocket holes. So I used my gauge block out of the K5, and I'm just manually clamping and drilling each pocket hole. So the far outside slats only have one hole in each end, and as you see, I used glue to reinforce that joint. For all of the subsequent slats, there are 2 pocket holes in each end, and the arc on the end of each one of those slats corresponds to the inside diameter of the tabletop. So I don't need any gauge blocks or anything like that. I just make sure that the edges are parallel, clamp it in place, and then run the screws home. And as you see, I ended up with really nice even spacing. Now, having a drum sander in the shop is a total luxury item, and I bought this years ago to save myself tons of time. If you don't have a drum sander, you can still absolutely take on this project. It'll just take you a little bit longer. Here I'm mainly using the drum sander to even out any small inconsistencies from all of those slats being screwed together. Okay, now here comes the fun part. We're moving on to the table legs. So first, I'm rough cutting out the majority of the material for the mortise that will accept the apron in the top of each one of these legs. Now, I've made a jig for my router to cut a arc that corresponds to the arc of the apron. The router bit that I had didn't go all the way to the bottom of this mortise, so I cut the first part here in my jig. Then I transferred it to a bench vise and cut the remainder of the mortise just sitting on top of the leg. And there we go, one very nice curved mortise. Now here I'm using a dado stack to cut a groove that will accept the bottom braces. Once all of these grooves are cut, I'm ready to start tapering the legs. Now I made a specific tapering jig for these legs, and these dedicated used taper jigs are super easy to make. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or shoot me an email and I'll help you out. So the first 2 sides, I don't need to use any shims, and you'll see what I mean here in a minute. Now before I started cutting the tapers, I made a mark on the bottom of the leg. And now that the first 2 sides are cut, I used a small piece of Luan as a spacer to push the bottom of that leg out just enough. So you see I have a gap against the fence, and the mark on the bottom of my leg lines up with the edge of the sled. So now the 2 remaining sides are both cut with that shim in place. So with all sides cut, take our leg out, take a look, and hey, it's tapered on all 4 sides. Okay, now we're getting back to some more template routing, and these aprons and braces can be a bit trepidatious just because it's smaller. So if you're nervous about this, make a larger jig instead of just using a template like I'm using here. But before I got started, I trimmed down these profiles as close as possible so that way I was removing a minimum amount of material. Now, just following the basic rules of grain direction and using a router, I was able to clean these up without any issue. With all these bottom braces to their final profiles, it's time to drill pocket holes for assembly. Now it's time to mark for counterbores and the aprons. Here I'm using an 1/8 inch transfer punch and then darkening it with a lead pencil. To drill the counterbores, I'm going to first start with a 3/8 Forstner bit. Then I'm going to follow up with a 3/16 twist bit, and that will fit these 1 1/4 inch stainless steel Craig screws. Now for the counterbore, I'm only drilling about a 1/2 inch deep. And if you go much more than 3/4 of an inch deep with that counterbore, your Craig screw is likely to go through your tabletop. Now at the oscillating sander, I'm just quickly cleaning up the profiles of these aprons and braces, and I'll do a little detail sanding just to clean things up. The surface on these table legs was actually pretty clean as is because I was using a ripping blade on my table saw to cut the tapers. But nonetheless, I started with 80 grit sandpaper and worked up to 180 for my final grit. Now when I ran the tabletops through my drum sander, I had 80 grit abrasive on the drums. Now that said, I still opted to start with 80 grit on these tabletops and then work my way up through the grits until I got to 180. The final detail is a little bit of hand sanding just to knock off the fuzz on the inside edges of each one of those slats, and then I do the same thing around the outside edge just to kill the corner. Alright, well, now it's IKEA assembly time. Actually, no, scratch that. This is a little bit more in depth than IKEA. The easiest method I could think of to assemble this was to use a band clamp around the apron and around the braces. Once the lower braces were in place, I used a handful of miniature easy hold clamps to hold them still. Once everything's where it's supposed to be, I really wrenched down those band clamps and then began running in the screws. Now since I'm intending to use these tables outside, I'm using Craig's stainless steel 1 1/4 inch long fine thread screws. I took it just a little bit easy because I didn't want to risk splitting the oak wood, and very happy to report I didn't have any issues with that at all. And the final step in assembling these tables is to attach the base to the top. I do this by running one screw through each one of the apron sections, and this provided a very sturdy connection. And there you have it, 2 outdoor side tables. Well, almost. Now it's time to stain. So for this we used Varathane's Classic Gray, and I'm using a foam brush to quickly apply it, and then an old Hanes t-shirt to wipe it down. I let the stain dry overnight, and then the next day I went back with General Finishes Exterior 450 in the satin sheen for our top coat. Alright, well that's going to wrap us up for the day. I hope you enjoyed the project, and hey, thanks for watching. Now make sure you check out the plans that are linked below, and a big thank you to Craig for sponsoring the project. Ah, you're still there. Awesome. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, I got another one queued up for you right here. And if you want other awesome content from me, check out those. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like and subscribe, and until next time, have fun making something.